Ready? Welcome, Charlotte saying, welcome to the Psychotherapeutic Principles. 4306, you know how we do. I think this will be hopefully an interesting presentation for you. Charlotte just wanted to say hi, I dropped the soother, so I'm going to cut this quick. But welcome. I hope you're having a good day, and today we're going to be talking about some of the more psychotherapeutic roots to this emerging field of positive psychology, and then after we sort of get through this presentation, we're going to start linking to how this has relevance for things like coaching and leadership and all those great things. Love being your teacher. This is a fun class. See you soon. Or I'll see you on the next slide. I'll be without the baby. But Charlotte just want to say hi. Can you say hi to the camera? Say, hey everyone. Have a fun class, hopefully. Okay. Welcome, my friends. Let's get into this presentation. I hope that this is interesting for you. I'm just at the beginning, obviously, of recording it, but I think I've set it out in a way that I hope is an interesting presentation. And again, I've kind of ended up, this wasn't really the intention. The intention was definitely to cover these topics, but not necessarily to do this like kind of timeline idea that I've been going with for the last few presentations, but it does really sort of help give an organizing focus to the presentation. So today we're going to be starting with Freud, obviously, and then talking about some early descent that happens in the school of psychoanalysis, right? So starting with Adler and Carl Jung and Horney, but then talk about how Freud also had his defenders too, like Otto Rank and like his daughter Anna. And so there was this, and then you start throwing in some of these other names like Maslow and Fritz Perls and Rollo May and William Glasser and Harry Stack Sullivan and John Bowlby and Alfred Ellis and Gordon Allport and Irvin Yallom and Carl Rogers, Viktor Frankl, Jean Piaget, Virgina Satir, Harry Harlow. That's going to be our mission for today, to look into all these names and how these are people that are adding pieces to this puzzle of this evolving story of, well, I'm calling this presentation Psychotherapeutic Principles. And so keep in mind sort of that the point of this course is all sort of leading towards this idea of how we're going to end the course focusing more on coaching and leadership. But my idea is that to understand positive psychology sort of fully, we need to understand not only its existential and phenomenological roots, but also its biological and evolutionary roots, and also its psychotherapeutic roots. So that's today, the psychotherapeutic roots. All right. So I'm actually quite interested in like the idea of how you've been taught about Freud. I'm interested, have your teachers dissed Freud? Like, do they all talk about Freud and focus on like the things wrong with his ideas, or do they do a decent job balancing it? Freud has the obvious disadvantage of going first. And what I mean by that is, why it's so hard to contextualize and make sense of Freud is because basically people remember his bad ideas, and his good ideas were so core to psychology that they just became psychology. And so it creates this really difficult hindsight factor where it's like, okay, some of Freud's ideas we now know, or we now have contradicting ideas. Not as much as people actually think, though. People say that all the time, but get them to list those. And then, but at the same time, it's like Freud was like writing the manual as he was going. It's like you have to give him some benefit of the doubt that he was literally making it up. Not in like a fake way, but in a way that these were largely original thoughts. Like, it's not like these ideas weren't floating around and that he wouldn't have been having conversations about some of this stuff. But like, Freud is so complex to think about because people, as I mentioned, kind of like to focus on the parts of his ideas that are hardest to defend, and that's fine if you're doing it honestly and if you're kind of making sense of the whole thing, right? Like, and that's why I'm gonna not dodge around this stuff, right? Like the critiques coming from Adler, Jung, and Horney are devastating, right? Like, Horney is gonna attack the penis envy thing big time. Carl Jung's gonna attack the sexuality aspect too and argue for a more mythical understanding of self. Adler's concept of inferiority is going to prove different. I'm going to talk about Adler's break with Freud because it's actually pretty interesting, because Adler was a huge, well, people kind of get it wrong and talk about that Adler was Freud's student, but they're more colleagues. Adler was impressed by Freud, but then they had a falling out. But you got to respect Adler, because even though they had a falling out, he still credits Freud for what he was. He disagreed with a lot of Freud's interpretations of dreams, but he credited Freud, for example, for like kind of starting this idea of dream analysis as more of a science, social science, or as more of a science, I should have just said, than had been done before. So having said all that, what did Freud give psychology? I think you have to start with the discussion that everyone that came after Freud had to deal with this idea of the unconscious mind. That you're not steering the ship as much as you think you are. You're more animal than you think. And that's actually because you have a deep, deep genetic biology and evolutionary inheritance. Freud wasn't ignorant of that stuff. Yeah, you've heard me make comments about how I think that Freud, if you've taken other classes with me, you've heard me make comments about how I think Freud was talking about genetics before the language for that kind of stuff exists. So a lot of his ideas sound weird because he's actually talking very biologically. But did you know that Freud was absolutely fascinated with ancient Egypt? Do you know that in his room where he would do therapy with people, it was filled with ancient Egyptian artifacts? I'm not sure why I told you that, but it's interesting. Very interesting person, and somebody that was a focal point for a lot of the people that are coming after in this presentation. So there's my shout out to Freud, the often misunderstood. It's like, do I defend every single point of his? No. But I'll assume Freud's right until someone shows me a better idea on individual topics, because of his demonstrated ability to read society and its discontent. It'll speak to you. And think about the fact that society and its discontent, Freud wrote that at the end of his life. Society and its discontent. And at that time, and you might have heard me say this before, sorry, but at that time in his life, he was just constantly in mouth pain, right? Because he had a prosthetic lower jaw from smoking so many cigarettes, so he basically had like a fake low jaw. And it would really hurt to put in, and really hurt to take out, and really hurt not to have in, which is terrible, right? Because that means like every stage of the process was super painful. It hurt him to have it in. It hurt in a different way when it wasn't in, and it hurt the most to put it in or take it out. It's like, oh my God, I can't imagine just having a sore tooth, how annoying that is. Like, imagine, I just think it's really interesting to think that when he wrote that book, he was going through this kind of very physical pain too, and he's reflecting over his career, and and that's kind of a challenge with a lot of great thinkers of that era, is like, How do you position their work now? Dr. Sigmund Freud.
It would not be easy to find another author, wrote Henry Ellenberger in The Discovery of the Unconscious, from which so much has been borrowed from all sides without acknowledgement than Alfred Adler. While Alfred...
Oh man, this is actually my second time on this slide. I had almost and this is going to sound scary to you maybe, because I had this slide at like 25 minutes because I went on this huge rant about Adler and how he fits in with the other schools, and then I checked the slide and I had put the video in. This is a good lesson for everyone. I had inserted the video, but I had it, if you click on the features or playback, I had it that it would start with on the click, not automatically. So you have to make sure that it's in automatically, or else I started talking and then the video just started playing itself the first time I clicked something, and then it was just over top of each other and not lined up right. So just keep that in mind. Adler though, absolute heavyweight. So if Adler disagreed with Freud about all kinds of things, and he often diverged from Freud, and that would frustrate Freud. And Adler's often talked about as Freud's student, but it would make more sense to refer to him sort of as a colleague, that they were around at the same time. It would not be easy to find another author who so much has been borrowed from all sides without acknowledgement than Adler. And if you listen to Audible and you want a cool book suggestion, The Discovery of the Unconscious by Ellenberg, classic.
Adler was one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century. He is greatly overshadowed by two of his contemporaries, Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. Adler's approach to understanding human behavior, however, has an appealing aspect which these two other men sometimes lack. He is extremely practical. He relied on a common-sense approach to explain why people behave as they do and how they can best go about changing their behavior to live more flourishing lives. One of the overriding themes of his work is that often the source of our suffering is not to be found in the way life challenges us, but in the solutions we adopt in the face of such challenges. And in this video, we will provide an overview of Adler's psychology in order to flesh out this idea. According to Adler, if we are to understand why a person behaves as they do, we must first recognize that humans have a tendency to strive after self-created goals. The first thing we discover in the psychic trends is that the movements are directed toward a goal. This teleology, this striving for goals, is innate in the concept of adaptation. Each of us holds a multitude of goals with respect to different aspects of our life. Our choice of these goals, according to Adler, is structured by a higher order goal called our self-ideal. Our self-ideal represents the ideal.
So think about this, because I was, again, in the lost footage that's lost to the world of my last time trying to record this slide. I went on this rant too about, nowadays we would just say our ideal self, right? This, that you want, we would almost say it just in reverse, that you have this, that sometimes what stresses us out is that we see our life being this way and we wish it was this other thing. We have this ideal vision of what we think ourself is or could be. We have this self-ideal
type of person we would like to become, and its formation begins early in childhood. How can we best find our place in this world, we wonder, and the way we answer this question forms our self-ideal. Our self-ideal, in other words, shapes the course of our life in that it points to the future and pulls us toward what could be, what might be. Our self-ideal plays a crucial role in our development in that it influences our striving for superiority, which according to Adler is the fundamental drive behind human behavior. We are, in other words...
So he had this idea of superiority, and I need you to be thinking about this in terms of the Adlerian way of using this word, that oftentimes people, because of trauma or because of certain types of parenting or for a variety of reasons, can have these, what he called inferiority complexes, right? These areas where they feel like they're weak. And that part of the goal of therapy is to convert those feelings of inferiority to superiority. And again, it's I know that obviously the word superiority kind of has a different tone these days, but to understand Adler, you sort of have to understand how he meant the word.
Naturally driven to improve our perceived lot in life, to gain a more advantageous position, or as Adler put it, The material of life has been constantly bent on reaching a plus from a minus situation. While the striving for superiority is innate, the specific manifestations of this striving are determined by the content of our self-ideal. We strive for superiority, in other words, by seeking to actualize our self-ideal. As we go through life, we learn what type of behaviors and thought patterns move us closer to our self-ideal.
And because of superiority kind of having a lot of connotations these days, it would almost be easier to explain Adler if he had used a different word. Like, he's sort of talking about this self-actualizing tendency of Maslow, or the being a fully functioning person, like Rogers would say, or this idea that like reaching a superior point is sort of becoming the person that you're trying to become. It's so confusing because Adler was a socialist, right? Like, his wife was actually good friends with Trotsky's wife, who was like a major Russian Marxist. And this is one of the things that Adler and Freud fought about. Freud wasn't a socialist. That was actually a huge rip in the psychoanalytic family, sort of. Jung wasn't a socialist. Erich Fromm was. So you had these people, and Erich Fromm spelled with two M's, like from, like how we would say to and from. It's from, but with a second M, and he was a big-time socialist, and so was this guy Adler. And they had huge influence on this other thing that I should talk about at some point. It's called the Frankfurt School, which was this attempt to like take psychoanalytic ideas and sort of merge it with Marxism. Freud wasn't a big fan. And so this is a group called the Frankfurt School, if you were to just Google that, right? Erich Fromm was huge with that. But that's a lesson for a different day. That's not directly tied to this course. That's more for like the one I do in the summer about culty stuff. So Adler found the Society of Individual Society of Individual Psychology in 1912. So this is really early. Remember, Freud's interpretation of dreams is only 1899. This is only 13 years later. And this is where I was saying about the socialists, because this is why I went on that rant. It's really confusing because Adler, his psychology is called individual psychology, which sounds like the last thing a socialist would call their psychology approach. But he meant a different use of the word individual. I have it written down here somewhere. Sorry, I got some notes here. I wanted to just tell you the actual. Oh yeah. So individual comes from an arcane reference to an old Latin spelling of individual that meant indivisible, right? So they're saying what he actually meant was that the person can't be divided from their world. They are their world. You know, Erickson's going to come a bit later with his psychosocial idea, but it's kind of the same idea. Erikson fits into this weird too. So think of like Adler and Freud as like contemporary friends, about the same age. Adler a bit younger. Jung is younger and is kind of the up and coming that's hugely impressed by Freud. But then Freud also has a daughter, Anna, who's intellectual heavyweight in her own right. And one of Anna's best friends is Erik Erikson. So it's like this is all a very, what's this, early psychoanalytic community. Adler, I thought you'd find this interesting too. Adler was heavily influenced by Nietzsche and Kant. So two people we talked about in the existential presentation. Yeah, put in bold, I was like, individual psychology, obviously a confusing term from a socialist, and it's true. It's like, it's because he's using the word individual differently. Adler was an early advocate of things like community psychology and using psychology as a way to do things like affect programming for kids. And you can see like how in that sense that there's that socialist social work kind of aspect to it. Another interesting point about Adler, then I'll jump back to this video, and I hope this is working because I said all this on the deleted video, the famous deleted video, but I had made the point that like PowerPoint went through a pretty major update a couple days ago, and like there's all these new functionalities in this record. But so I would really push you, like if you're interested in making videos, you should get, I think you have access as an IPSing student, but you should get the newest PowerPoint and use it to make videos. It's pretty awesome. I got my notes on the side here on the screen, the video. The only thing is I'm just hoping it's all synced well. But the last point I wanted to make before going back to the video is that Adler also had this idea of what he called safeguarding techniques. And I want you to think of that as sort of the same idea of defense mechanisms that Anna Freud's going to come out with, right? So sort of based on Freud's work, his daughter sort of articulates this idea of defense mechanisms a little bit later, but Adler has this idea of safeguarding techniques. Right, so I have here, Adler spoke of safeguarding techniques in neurotic behavior long before Anna Freud wrote about the same phenomena in her classic book, Ego and Defense Mechanisms. Okay, let's go back to the video. I hope this is all working nice.
And which hinder us. In the process, we develop what Adler called our lifestyle, which is the subjective, unarticulated set of guidelines individuals develop and use to move.
Okay, I would recommend writing this down. This is an awesome quote. What's a lifestyle? Right, like think about if you say you were dating someone, or say your friend's dating someone, and you're like, oh, what do you think about this guy or whatever? And she's like, oh, he's pretty nice, but I don't really like approve of his lifestyle. It's like we use that word all the time. Like, what does that mean? And what Adler thought, and this is where we actually get this language, is that you have this like, well, it's like you have all these goals in your life that you're trying to achieve, and they're not just linear. So it's not like you're going goal 1, goal 2, goal 3, and it's just like you're like checking it off as if you're like Mario going through levels. It's like that's not what life's like. Life, you have all kinds of goals that are all complex and are all embedded in your social environment. So you live a life in a certain style to try to hit all these goals, right? You go to work a certain way, you get up a certain way, you sleep a certain way, you interact a certain way, you experience emotion a certain way. You have these subjective, unarticulated sets of guidelines that an individual develops to use to move through life and towards their goals. It's an awesome idea. Another interesting thing here is that Adler challenged one of his first big, I'll just say this because I have it in my note and it's not directly linked to lifestyle, but I think you'll find this a cool point. So Freud had this idea that sexuality and that the libido directed sexuality and aggression, and that basically those two primal instincts were kind of being influenced by the same process. It's like one process or one instinct there. That there's this instinct is the word I should be using. There's one instinct that affects both sexuality and aggression. Adler presented this idea that he didn't challenge the idea that there's deep sexual and aggressive instincts, but he thought that they were distinct, they were different things. So this is called a dual instinct model, that actually aggression and sexuality are different instincts, not just different manifestations of the same thing. So that was a pretty big difference. And then Freud disagreed with him, but then Freud later releases this idea of dual instinct theory, doesn't cite Adler. This created a huge breakup between them. Freud later commented that I myself have been obliged to assert the existence of this aggressive instinct. Like, stop saying Adler did it. It's kind of interesting because this got very beefish, right? Like very, very public, a very public feud.
Move them through life and toward their goals. Adler was insistent that we cannot, in an a priori manner, judge a lifestyle as healthy or unhealthy, normal or abnormal. Rather, we can only observe it in action and see what success it brings. For Adler, there was no normal lifestyle. Every lifestyle was adequate until life presented it with a task for which it was not prepared. It was at those times that its weak points emerged. The weak points of our lifestyle frustrate us in our pursuit of superiority and trigger feelings of inferiority. Feelings of inferiority are based on the subjective evaluations we make of ourselves or the conclusions we draw with respect to our ability to reach our goals. Inferiority feelings are often triggered by what are called objective inferiorities, which are inferiorities that are based on some measurable criteria in comparison to another. For example, we may be objectively inferior in terms of our
your friends like having cooler cars than you or something. That's not the best example, but well, it is actually. It's like sometimes it's just straight up objective. It's like the people around you have more stuff than you, and it's stuff you want, right? If like, say someone has a bunch of dolls, way more dolls than you, but you don't care about dolls, that doesn't affect your inferiority. If somebody has something that you would associate with your self-worth way more than you, it affects it, right? So this is kind of a point that Adler talks about a lot, that the world that you care about is like significantly different than the world that you don't care about. He said it in a more articulate way, but I think that's a really wild, deep point. Because it's actually a visual system thing. Your brain just registers different things that you don't immediately see as a tool or as useful.
Strength or height, the amount of money we earn, or our skill at a certain activity. An objective inferiority, however, only triggers feelings of inferiority if it is somehow important to our striving after superiority. If, for example, someone is poor, but money is not an important part of their self-ideal, their lack of wealth will not trigger inferiority feelings. On the other hand, feelings of inferiority can arise in the absence of objective inferiorities. Very often people perceive themselves to be inferior in ways which have no basis in reality. How we react and adapt.
Okay, so now think about that. That's a very different idea. It's like, well, sometimes you'll feel inferior. You'll feel like inferior when you go to, if I like went to play pickup basketball and it's like, okay, Mike, show up at 7 o'clock and I walk in the gym. I'm like 5'10 and a half, maybe 5'11. I walk in the gym. Everyone's like 6'5 and dunking and everything. It's like, the chances of me having some inferiority feelings are pretty high. It's like, but that is kind of objective. That makes sense in that context. It's objective. It's like, well, those people can like literally play basketball better than I can. So it's a very, like you could give them a score and give me a score, mine's lower. So it's objective that I feel inferior is kind of the idea. But then he's saying that also though, sometimes people can like, to use a more modern term from positive psychology, develop like a learned helplessness, right? And like kind of see themselves as in a state that's, well, more glass half empty than their life really is.
To our inferiorities strongly impacts our psychological health and the overall quality of our life. Adler suggested there are two primary ways people deal with feelings of inferiority. Either we see the circumstances which produce them as challenges to be confronted and so make use of coping behaviors, or we view them as problems to be avoided and resort to safeguarding behaviors. Coping behaviors can be divided.
Okay, so Adler thought basically coping was like the healthy response, and safeguarding, and again, remember I made the point earlier, his word safeguarding and Anna Freud's word defense mechanism are basically the same. You've heard of like denial and repression and subjugation, not subjugation, what am I thinking of? Projection, regression, denial. I'm forgetting one of the main ones, and it's making my brain glitch. All right, sorry. But if you could just go to like my very first presentation, History of Therapeutic Psych, on this YouTube channel, and you don't have to obviously, but like I go over all the main defense mechanisms. Sublimation is what I was trying to say. So, but yeah, so this is kind of really interesting, right? He's like, everybody has stress. It's not if you have stress that determines your mental health. It's how you respond. It's like, and obviously, there's major differences between people. But what he's saying is like, all that aside, there's ways people can cope, or there's ways people can basically avoid, safeguard themselves, defense mechanisms.
Into two types: direct problem solving and compensation. When we believe we can directly address the cause of our inferiority feelings, we adopt a problem solving approach. If we lose a job, we look for another one. If our skills are inadequate in a certain endeavor, we spend time improving them. If, on the other hand, direct problem solving is impossible.
So sorry, I don't mean to pause a million times, although that's sort of my style, but think about this idea of focus on problem solving, and then think about how I said he was a socialist, and see how you can link that to like kind of modern social work in a way. Now, socialist and social work aren't the same thing, because the social work movement actually came out of more religious communities in Western Europe. The history, I actually took an awesome class in high school in university, on the history of the profession of social work. It's actually really interesting, because it comes from because if you go back a few hundred years, who was the social workers? It was all the church communities. That was it. Maybe a random philanthropist or two, but there wasn't state welfare and stuff like that. So a lot of it was through the church, and you had these movements that started. Anyways, I don't have to get into it, but I don't have to start talking about the Jesuits and stuff. But there's a lot of interesting history there. But anyways, you can the point I was kind of briefly trying to make before going on an epic rant here, epically long, I should say, is just that you can kind of see if somebody's focusing on a very problem-solving approach to psychology, that's going to be okay. And this is where at the bottom I have the words exteriority and interiority. If you could add those to your notes, it's this is one of the big break points of him and Freud. Freud was very focused on interiority. It's the problems you're dealing with are psychodynamic. They're deep within your mind. They're deep within your unconscious mind, if we're being Freudian, right? Whereas Adler's saying, a lot of the issues that you're dealing with are actually external to you. They're in your exteriority. It's weird because I want to add an N into that word that's not there. Because it's the same word as external, right? It's just basically Adler's made up word that means things affecting your mental health that are outside you. And obviously that's the case too, right? And obviously you could see how somebody that has kind of, philosophical similarities to what we would now consider social work would be focused on this idea of how the world around the person influences them. Which again, that's why I said at the beginning, a really weird approach to call individual psychology, right? You'd almost think individual psychology would be more like what we're going to talk about later in this presentation. William Glasser has an idea called choice theory and about personal responsibility and all this kind of stuff. And it's if you just told me define what you think individual psychology would be, I would guess it would be something like that, if I didn't know who Adler was. So the name's confusing. He's using individual in a different sense. Please still work.
We may resort to the coping behavior called compensation. We look for ways to make up for our inferiority by excelling in a manner which can compensate for our deficit. For example, someone who loses their hearing may compensate by cultivating the ability to read lips. Many people, however, are unwilling to address their issues in this manner and so turn to safeguarding behaviors.
So compensation is interesting. It's funny because I was thinking, what's a cool example of compensation? I was trying to think of different ones. My head just kept saying, mention Napoleon, because he's the Napoleon complex classic, right? Napoleon's super short. He feels made fun of for being short. He eventually wants to be so masculine as a compensation that he tries to take over Europe. The whole Battle of Waterloo, all that kind of stuff. But it's that's an interesting point, right? That even if you just, I know it's the history around Napoleon is really complex and he's a fascinating person in a lot of ways, Napoleon Bonaparte, but if you just look at that kind of concept, right? That it's because he's small physically, he wants to look tough, so much so that he becomes one of the biggest war admirals of all time. And that's obviously not the whole story of Napoleon. You have to understand the French Revolution and all that kind of stuff. But it's just an interesting thought.
Safeguarding behaviors are used in the attempt to convince oneself and others that the reason they have failed to address their inferiorities and moved closer to their goals is because certain obstacles, which they claim lie outside of their control, are impeding their progress. Adler likened safeguarding behaviors to the sideshows seen at a circus, as they are used to distract attention away from the most pressing issues of one's life, and to direct it instead to issues which are relatively trivial. Safeguarding behaviors take a variety of forms. Some people develop physical issues such as headaches or chronic tiredness, which are then used as excuses for why they cannot face up to their challenges. Others develop anxiety disorders which are used in a similar manner. They use their fears as a justification for why they cannot take the actions needed to move them closer to their goals. At other times, Instead of relying on excuses and symptoms, people turn to the safeguarding behavior that Adler called distance seeking. This entails procrastination, or only taking the tiniest of steps forward before falling back into one's comfort zone. While we all make use of safeguarding behaviors to one degree or another, problems arise when the use of them goes on for too long. For as Ellenberger noted in The Discovery of the Unconscious, Adler saw those who rely on safeguarding behaviors as pitiful individuals who made use of transparent tricks in order to escape life's duties. Safeguarding behaviors eventually lose their effectiveness. We can only rely on certain excuses for so long before others see through them. When this happens, we have two options. We can begin to address our issues head-on, or we can completely withdraw from the challenge, thus developing what Adler called an inferiority complex. To avoid this fate, we must cease relying on safeguarding behaviors and learn to directly face up to our challenges.
Stored energy.
Adler believed that sometimes the reason people struggle to do this is because they have adopted a self-ideal which is unconducive to a healthy existence. Perhaps our self-ideal is overly perfectionist, or too reliant on the pursuit of such things as wealth, status, power, fame, or beauty. In other words, our self-ideal is so unrealistic that we are forever thwarted in our attempts to achieve our goals, and so we resort to safeguarding behaviors, not knowing what else to do. Therefore, becoming more aware of what we are striving for and adjusting our self-ideal, if necessary, is a crucial step towards self-improvement. In the end, however, even with a more realistic self-ideal, we will only change if we learn to be more courageous.
Look at that picture.
Adler believed that the most basic
awesome
concern of
imagery.
psychotherapy should simply be to help people cultivate a more courageous attitude toward life. Courage, wrote Adler, is not an ability one either possesses or lacks.
So Adler writes a lot about courage, and it's an important message for us in 2022. It's like, what's the most psychologically protective variable? One of them, courage. And this is the thing that you have to teach kids, is courage and not being afraid aren't the same thing. Courage is actually what you do when you are afraid. It's like when I watch a movie with my daughter, a Disney movie, and there's a scary scene. I always tell her, look at the hero. Look at what the hero's doing. Disney knows about heroes. You don't think Walt Disney knew about hero archetypes? Pinocchio, maybe the deepest story of traveling to the underworld to regain the ancestor soul. Maybe the best example of that ever told. You know I can't stop talking about Kung Fu Panda once I start. I don't know if that's actually Disney, but anyways. Yeah, courage. You don't need courage when everything's easy. It's a variable that increases in worth the harder the situation.
Courage is the willingness to engage in a risk-taking behavior, regardless of whether the consequences are unknown or possibly adverse. We are capable of courageous behavior, provided we are willing to engage in it. Given that we cannot expect life to cease challenging us, we have a choice. Either we cultivate a courageous attitude and learn to coexist with the uncertainty and discomfort this will invite into our life, or we doom ourselves to waste away our days, receding further and further into the misery of our comfort zone.
Oh. Or, you hear that last ending? Either you face the challenges that are uniquely yours, or you get absorbed by the depression of your comfort zone. He used a different word, but I'm going to save this. This is almost a half hour. I hope that this was interesting. I feel like when I was growing up and going through school, Adler wasn't emphasized as much as other people. And so I wanted to take a little bit extra time with him. You'll notice my Freud slide was like 5 minutes. I've talked at length about Freud. Freud's super important. And it's not that he's not important, but it's that I wanted to spend some time today talking about this world around Freud, because it's so key to the early psychological scenario. So now, Adler's the first to break. Right? So remember, it's largely around this idea that, first of all, he was just annoying to have around from Freud. Freud respected him, thought he was smart, but found it annoying that Adler would always be trying to kind of like one-up him. And remember who Freud was at this time, like massive rock star. It was like everyone else is like taking notes when he's writing. Adler's like challenging every idea. So to Freud and who Freud was, that got old. And then also the breakdown around the dual instinct thing, and then also the fact that Freud was upset about his wife being so close with Trotsky, right? Because like, again, I'm trying to wrap up this slide, so maybe I won't talk about what was happening in the USSR at that time, but a lot of stuff, right? And so Trotsky's like a very prominent Marxist at that time. Remember, so at that time, like, Marxism's really picking up steam in Russia by the end of Adler's life, and by the time he's starting to do a lot of his stuff with Freud, like 1920, right? So think about 1920. This is still pre-World War II, but Nazism is not very far away, and it's going to force actually a lot of these people out, right? And we're going to talk today later about Frankl, who was literally in one of the camps. Freud escaped to America basically because of some of his American supporters got him out. Adler got out early. Jung got out. Erikson was already in the States. So all these, it's just, I don't know, I find it so fascinating that like this is all heavily embedded in the last 150 years. The history of psychology. And I think that would actually be an awesome course. And if any of you are interested and want it, because maybe you'd find it super boring, but maybe you wouldn't, man, it'd be cool to look at how psychology is related to World War II. And I would argue that like it's very hard to understand modern politics if you don't have a deep understanding of World War II, and it's impossible to understand World War II without World War I. That might be another day. It'd be interesting to see how, instead of just going on World War II, it'd be interesting to look at like the social world in which psychology developed, which is sort of, I guess, what I'm doing right here. Because I've always thought that mattered. You know what kind of cracked my cosmic egg on that was that there's an old book by a guy named Donald Walsh or something like that. But it's called The Crack in the Cosmic Egg. You should look it up. It's an epic book. But it means like when you have these like, well, think of what the cosmic egg that gives birth to the universe, there's a crack in it. The modern way of saying it is my glitch in the matrix moment was like learning about Erikson's involvement with the missile systems in World War II, and it's like, oh, that's so wild. But of course they'd be employing their high-end psychologists. Obviously they were. Obviously the Russians were too. It's interesting that the history of psychology is like you got like Pavlov and Tchaikovsky and some of these really well-known Russians, and then you got like Americans, and then you got this kind of real hotspot in Vienna in Austria, which is where we get Freud and his whole crew, and then there's like a few random people, like say R.D. Laing out of Scotland. But basically everyone we're talking about today is going to be coming from either Russia, the Austria area, which at the time of them, a lot of them leaving that area was occupied by Germany, and then America, right? Because in America you have William James, and then you have Skinner, and then you have well, a lot of them. Then you have like Rogers, and a lot of the people we're going to be ending the course talking about, Glaser, and Rollo May. I think he's a Swiss, so we'll talk about him too. So there is a few random ones. Okay, Mike, quit. Let's get on to the next slide. Carl Jung next. I hope this worked.
This video is sponsored by the book summary service, Blinkist. The first 100 people to use the link in the description will receive 1 free week of unlimited access and 25% off a full membership. We feel as though we are in the driver's seat of our mind, driving according to our conscious will. But upon only a little introspection, we realize, at least in many cases, we are merely following a built-in navigation system that exceeds our knowledge and understanding. We perceive but the display screen atop an entire...
Jeez. There's Carl Jung for you. Right? That's the problem. We don't understand the GPS system that's running this whole show. Carl Jung, the deepest of the deep. The Lord of the Underworld. That's a book, actually. If you remember the presentation I did on existentialism and phenomenology, I ended with referencing Colin Wilson, and Colin Wilson wrote a book about Carl Jung called The Lord of the Underworld. Because Jung went so deep into this connection between the unconscious and the myths of humans.
Complex software run on an even more complex hardware. If we do not attempt to familiarize ourselves with this navigation system, how it works, where it's trying to go, and how to override it when it sends us the wrong direction, we risk aimlessly traveling the world, ending up somewhere uninteresting at best and disastrous at worst. 20th century Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung is perhaps one of the greatest and most capable minds that has ever attempted to do this, to explore itself from the inside and conceptualize a complete understanding of this sort of internal navigation system from the top down. Jung was born in 1875 in Caswell, Switzerland, to a relatively impoverished rural pastor, Paul Jung, and a depressed, eccentric, spirit-seeing mother, Emily Jung. Jung was a very introverted and isolated child.
So he said something quick there that was really important. Depressed, but also spirit-seeing. So think of what that means, right? Like, nowadays we would maybe call it schizophrenic, or, like, she thought that she saw things, and this had a huge influence on Jung, and maybe they're going to talk about that, but that's just an interesting point.
Who spent much of his time alone, engaging in activities of make-believe, projection, disassociation, and analyzing the adults in his life. During early childhood, he strongly disliked and underperformed in school to the point of almost neurosis, regularly fainting to get out of it. However, as age and maturity would have it, and after his father expressed stern concern over his potential incompetence, Jung somewhat dramatically shifted to engaging more intensely in his education, reading actively on his own, especially that of philosophy and religious texts. Following secondary school, after determining that he did not want to follow the family's path of a religious vocation, Jung would end up pursuing medicine at the University of Basel. After getting his completed medical degree from the University of Zurich in 1902, he would work at a psychiatric hospital under the prominent and well-connected psychiatrist Eugene Bleuler. Several years later, he would leave the hospital and begin his own private practice. As Jung became more successful and well-known in his field, he would soon become acquainted with the extremely popular, groundbreaking, and controversial psychologist of the time, who still holds this title today, Sigmund Freud. The two would meet for the first time in 1907, upon which they would talk for around 13 hours straight. This would quickly develop into a strong friendship and professional association. They traveled the world and lectured together, analyzed each other's dreams, and discussed various aspects of their psychological studies and theories. However, Freud, being of a much greater professional stature at the time, as well as being substantially older than Jung, created a dynamic in the friendship that was much more like a father-son or teacher-pupil relationship. This would unfortunately pose problems as Jung's career advanced and began to encroach on Freud's. The two would soon find themselves in disagreements over fundamental aspects of each other's theories. Ultimately, these disagreements, Jung's tendency toward a somewhat mystical consideration of the human mind, as opposed to Freud's more scientific, reductionist approach, the nature of their father-son relationship, and Jung's desire for professional independence, all caused the two to split their friendship off in 1913. Following and as a consequence of this breakup, from around 1913 to 1918, Jung experienced a sort of midlife psychological breakdown. During this, he spent much of his time introspecting and writing about psychological experiments he conducted on himself, exploring into the recesses.
So he goes into this period of, like, it depends what people call it, right? Some people call it his creative break. Some people call it like him losing his mind. He goes through this period of like incredible introspection where he's just like kind of throwing himself into himself. He comes out of it writing this red book. You can probably find it. You probably have the red book in your library at Nipsey. It's pretty popular, and it's like, and you can definitely find it online, and it's really interesting because it's filled with some of the most interesting art. It's got a lot of pictures in it. But this is where he starts to come up with the concept of the collective unconscious, which I bet they're about to go into here.
Of his unconscious. This period of transition, independence, and psychological turbulence would ultimately concretize his views of the mind and his career as an independent theorist of psychology. Put simply, the primary objective of Jung's career was to understand the nature of the psyche and then develop theories and methods to aid in the integration of all its components so to create a singular, unified state of wholeness. In this context, the psyche here simply refers to the complete personality of the individual, including feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, the combination of the unconscious and conscious mind. The continuous striving toward integrating the psyche through a process of self-realization and becoming a maximized, authentic individual, for Jung, was the fundamental goal of life and psychological understanding. Man's task, he wrote, is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious. As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. For Jung, there's a
The sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. That's an awesome quote. In the Jung Reader, he has a whole chapter on this concept called the transcendent function. You should look that up, it's interesting.
Constant interplay between the unconscious and conscious realms of the psyche, which combine to create our complete personality. Most of this, however, develops and exists in the unconscious realm, beneath our immediate awareness and control. Thus, a significant portion of who we really are, what we really like and are capable of, and the reasons we do the things we do, persist within a realm we don't actively understand or have access to. And so, in order to come into a more authentic and complete state of being, the individual must attempt to make this portion of the psyche conscious by tapping into it and integrating it into the whole of their awareness. Jung would call this process individuation. In order to better understand this, it is important to understand Jung's model of the psyche, which he divided, starting with the broader dimensions, into consciousness, personal unconsciousness, and collective unconsciousness. Breaking each of these three realms down, consciousness is, as one...
Right, so Jung was fascinated by this idea of why he was fascinated with things like cave paintings, and why would you see these cave paintings that were similar all around the world? In China and in places in Africa and in places in Western Europe and in places in Mesoamerica. And you started to have this thought okay, well, maybe they weren't communicating. Maybe they were all in these trance-like states and accessing these deep aspects of consciousness. And that maybe it's that all of their deep consciousness has similarities. Almost if there's a collective unconscious. So this is kind of where this idea comes from. So he said that there's what you're aware of, and then there's the part of the unconscious that you're participating in but not aware of, and that's just a part of a bigger river of the collective unconscious. It's a wild idea.
One would typically think of it, the realm of personal awareness, where one identifies explicitly and knowingly with themselves. At the core of this is another structure Jung identified, the ego. The ego sits at the center of consciousness and provides a sense of personal distinction, creating the story one tells themselves about themselves in order to maintain continuity in their identity. The ego is expressed in the conscious realm by what Jung called the persona, which is the outward efforts of appearance which the individual actively displays to the world. This persona, however, is often disjointed from the individual's true self, as it displays the character that one thinks or wants to be according to what the ego deems is appropriate to a particular society and role, and not what is true to who the individual actually is. In order to execute and maintain this suitable appearance and self-esteem, the ego filters various components of personal experience and selfhood either into or away from the conscious dimension. What it filters away and restricts, it represses and sends down into the unconscious realm. One of Jung's most unique and profound insights that differentiates him most notably from other psychologists is how, from here, he separated the unconscious into two distinct structures, the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. The personal unconscious fits similarly into the ideas already understood and proposed by...
Yeah, and keep in mind this collective unconscious is a major deviation from Freud now. Freud was with him until he got to this collective unconscious point.
Freud and others of the time, in which, after the ego represses and disregards undesirable aspects of experience and selfhood, these aspects are stored and concealed here, just beneath normal awareness. They still, however, continue to actively affect and interact back and forth with consciousness. The collective unconscious, however, differentiates from the personal unconscious and other prior conceptions of the psyche in that, according to Jung, it contains and facilitates universal elements that are inherited through the sum total of human history, similar in some sense to how biological evolution works. Man has developed consciousness slowly and laboriously in a process that took untold ages to reach the civilized state, and this evolution is far from complete, for large areas of the human mind are still shrouded in darkness, wrote Jung. As a result of each generation of human offspring essentially imitating the behaviors of the previous generation to at least some degree, an unbroken chain of psychological imitation is formed, going all the way back to the beginning of human history. Thus, a sort of reservoir of psychological predispositions, structures, and memories that have been formed by this chain is automatically inherited by each human being. Jung found this to be empirically demonstrable in both his own professional psychiatric practice, finding recurring similarities in the unconscious of a vast number of his patients, as well as his historical and mythological research, in which he noticed that similar motifs, symbols, and themes that appeared in his patients' unconscious also were prevalent and consistent across art, myths, and literature within different cultures of different times, even though these cultures often never even encountered one another. In Jung's view, these shared motifs, symbols, and themes were expressions of the various psychic structures consistent across humanity, which he called archetypes. These archetypes, in Jung's model of the psyche, essentially form the basis of the individual's personality by predisposing specific cognitive tendencies. Within the combined unconscious, Jung would refer to all the repressed, denied, and unknown content which the ego does not want to identify with as the shadow. Lastly, sort of nested within the shadow is what Jung broke down into the animus and anima, which specifically referred to the suppressed feminine qualities in a male, anima, and the suppressed masculine qualities in a female, animus. According to Jung, all the aforementioned structures of the psyche work together in active circulation to ultimately form what lies at the center, the self, the combined authentic totality of the unconscious and conscious. The self is who the individual actually is, what they actually desire, what they actually like, what they are actually capable of, and so on. Simply put, getting the ego and a high degree of the persona as close to this as possible is the goal of individuation and ultimately a fulfilled life. Whether it's through methods like therapy, introspection, personal development toward authenticity, or some combination, ultimately, for Jung, it is the task of the individual to determine and strive toward this. In all cases, this sort of self-realization requires an effort of radical self-acceptance, and radical self-acceptance requires an effort of radical self-honesty. In order to actively move deeper into the psyche, each opportunity one takes to examine a personal feeling, thought, or action, they must attempt to do so by accepting the complete and often undesirable potentiality of what it truly indicates about themselves, that they are not always who they think or hope they are. Each of these capitalized opportunities, personal or professional, is like a small step down the stairwell into the unconscious. As one goes further down, however, as they confront these deeper and darker elements of their being hidden in the basement, they must, in Jungian terms, work to integrate their shadow, the breadth of their potential faults and wickedness, as opposed to rushing back up the stairs in denial. One's shadow does not disappear by looking away from it. In the same way one cannot literally evade the light-casted shadow of their body by outrunning it, there is no move or evasive tactic that separates the individual from their psychological shadow. The danger, rather, is in the attempt to do so, the ignorance and denial of it. Good does not become better by being exaggerated, but worse, and a small evil becomes a big one through being disregarded and repressed. The shadow is very much a part of human nature, and it is only at night that no shadows exist, wrote Jung. Awareness of one's dark side allows one to more appropriately manage and recognize it when it sneaks up the stairs uninvited. One must know of a problem to be able to fix it, and it is an act of healing to admit that one is sick. Although self-acceptance and authenticity is perhaps simple and obvious enough sounding, the act of actually working towards radical self-acceptance and individuation is, of course, far from simple and obvious. In the absolute sense, it is almost certainly impossible. In the above-average sense, it is still perhaps life's greatest and most difficult endeavor. To truly and honestly accept your downfalls, weaknesses, potential evils, and shameful or unpopular interests and qualities, to admit what you see, fear, or hate in others is and could be inside of you, to admit to yourself that you are not and will never be completely who you think and want to be, that you are not as good as you had hoped, and to confront what your mind has worked a lifetime to keep from itself is a task that literally shakes the very core of the psyche. However, it is perhaps proportionally essential for a fulfilled and complete life. Ultimately, Jung's work provides insights, theories, and methods to help the individual move through this process toward not only potentially gaining access to fixing the bugs in their navigation system, but also, in some sense, access to the controls where now they can better input the destination coordinates according to where they actually can and want to go.
Boom. Pulls himself right back to that.
This video was sponsored by Blinkist.
I hope that
Whether you're interested in learning more about Jung's theories, Sigmund Freud's, or other individuals and concepts in psychology, there is certainly no shortage of great literature. So much so that it would likely take an entire lifetime just to get through a portion of it at an average reading pace. Of course, this problem in general can make it hard to engage with the full breadth and depth of any areas of nonfiction literature that one is interested in, which sometimes can even discourage one from reading much at all. However, the book summary app, Blinkist, helps solve this problem by streamlining the reading and learning process by providing the overviews, chapter takeaways, and essential information of complete nonfiction books in just around 15-minute summaries, which can be both read or listened to conveniently in otherwise small pockets of downtime. In only around 15 minutes, you can learn more about Jung's ideas of archetypes and the unconscious, and man and his symbols, Freud's key theories on the nature of dreams and the interpretation of dreams, or a modern analysis on personality types in The Four Tendencies by Gretchen Rubin. Ultimately, no matter what your interests are, with 27 categories of thousands of nonfiction titles to choose from, Blinkist allows you to explore vastly more topics and books in a way that would otherwise take massive amounts of extra time. And even better, Blinkist now also has complete audiobooks of select titles, as well as podcast summaries from popular podcasts, so you can delve into complete books and topics that you want to get the full comprehensive scope of, all in the same place. The first 100 people to use the link in the description will receive 1 free week of unlimited access, as well as 25% off a full membership. The free 7-day trial can be canceled at any time within the trial period. And of course, as always, thank you so much for watching in general, and see you next video.
Pursuit of wonder. Alright, see you on the next slide, my friends. I hope that worked. I know that it hiccuped a little bit around the 13-minute mark, which I hope isn't fatal to this. I might have to do this one again for a third time, but I'll catch you on Harry Stack Sullivan if this went okay. Okay, my friends, I'm just gonna kill my video for a sec just so you can see this full slide. I realized I just watched back that Carl Jung one. I realized I need to pause whenever I'm making points that, especially when I'm like talking quietly. If the video is playing, you can't hear me. So I was kind of just making random points too. So I need to kind of just be a little bit more conscious of the volume difference. So I'm aware of that. Harry Stack Sullivan, super interesting person. Huge in the establishment of what's going to become called psychiatry. Okay, huge in conceptualizing psychiatry as a social science. Very interested in looking at it sort of as a sociologist. So how it is related to all these other social dynamics and kind of social economic factors and family dynamics and workplace and all that kind of stuff. Stack Sullivan was also very, because he would have been traditionally have a Freudian training, and he was very wary of this emerging trend in psychology to everything being short-term outcome focused and kind of losing the depth psychology focus. So I thought that was interesting. He taught about this idea about the psychiatric interview, like how to, which is kind of like a very specific type of counseling for people that are in some of the most extreme kind of psychiatric need. Emphasizing the here and now. Sullivan's approach was to focus on the interpersonal relationship in order to alter inappropriate patterns of relatedness, right? So he found that a lot of the people he was working with would have like really inappropriate behavior, and so he had to use his relationship with them to help show them how that's not appropriate. Like, it's a very much using himself as a therapeutic tool to help the person see where these patterns are shaped by current experience of anxiety, insecurity, avoidance. Right, so he thought that like so much of this stuff was situated in relationships. So let me just read that again, because I kind of like added my own filler in the middle. Emphasizing the here and now, Sullivan's approach was to focus on the interpersonal relationship in order to alter appropriate patterns of relatedness, patterns shaped by the current and past experiences of anxiety, insecurity, and avoidance. Right, so think about that. He thought that often the issue were related to anxiety, insecurity, and avoidance. And that created interpersonal problems. And those interpersonal problems created psychiatric problems. Think of how intense that basic insight is. That most of it's anxiety, insecurity, and avoidance that can create interpersonal havoc, that can create psychiatric illness. So as the psychoanalytic community or whatever is emerging, it's dividing and it's splintering. And even though there's these like very vocal people starting to oppose some of Freud's central ideas, like Carl Jung and Adler, there are very much also intellectual heavyweights basically on Freud's side. Like if you look at this book, Will Therapy, and it says there's a subtitle, the therapeutic applications of will psychology. Interesting, right? So Otto Rank is one of Sigmund Freud's best friends, and he's like a heavyweight. He's the head of this, like, where I have here, he's managing director of the publishing house. He wrote extensively on psychoanalytic ideas. So if you wanted, like, he wrote a lot of in defense of Freud kind of stuff, right? So Freud has this, like, I think I have it on the next point. The secret ring. Sounds like Lord of the Rings, right? He was the most prolific writer in a group called the Secret Ring, which was Freud's inner circle, basically going against the claims of people like Jung and Adler. You can find all these letters, all these essays, right? He was fascinated with the hero, the archetype of the hero, right? Which is another one of Jung's big archetypes, but in our current culture, there's been a real death of the hero archetype. It's interesting. I wonder what Otto Rank would have to say about that. He was also fascinated with the stories around the births of heroes, right? So the birth of Hercules and the story around that, and he thought that they had similarities to religious creation myths. I thought that this was something that surprised me when I was researching this, so I was like kind of researching all these guys to just have a couple interesting extra points to say. I didn't realize that he actually wrote full chapters in interpretation of dreams. So think about that. Like, he wrote a chapter on myth and a chapter of legend. That's pretty epic. In Freud's Interpretation of Dreams, the book that basically is like the beginning of psychology in a lot of ways. 1899. I got one more point here. So if you want one idea from Rank that kind of helps you understand his general idea, he thought that things were incredibly situated. He thought that like almost everything you feel and everything you're experiencing is based on right now. And it's like right now in terms of how you're feeling, in terms of what's going on around you, in terms of your physicality. Physicality being a huge one. All emotions are grounded in the present. And he has this term here and now, right? That we have to understand the here and now, and what might be upsetting us right now, and therefore making us upset and clouding our interpretation of whatever the thing is that's bothering us. For the only therapy is life, The patient must learn to live with his split, his conflicts, his ambivalence, which no therapy can take away. For if it could, it would take away the actual spring of life. Otto Rank.
Why do so many people fail to flourish? And what can we do in our own life to ensure we do not succumb to the states of apathy, self-sabotage, and fear which abound in the lives of the mass of men? In a series of books, the 20th century psychoanalyst Karen Horney explored the idea that many people undermine their own well-being as a result of unconscious disturbances which influence their thoughts and behaviors. In this video, we are going to examine
that a lot of people undermine their own well-being because of these unconscious impulses that influence their behavior and undermine their own well-being. Yeah, Horney, what an interesting person, a German psychoanalyst. Her theories question the traditional Freudian views. She's credited with creating this thing called feminist psychology, or just sort of like feminist psychology is like a branch within psychoanalysis. She almost had like I wouldn't say feminist psychology, although that actually is like a term that refers to her school, but like in hindsight, how you could kind of view it is it's like almost like a feminist view of psychoanalytic ideas, right? She's still sort of in this broad category of psychoanalysts. I think she eventually called herself neo-Freudian. Like I think she eventually completely broke with Freud. Maybe not actually. Yeah, Horney looked at neurosis. I might be confusing her and someone else, but Horney looked at neurosis in a different light from other psychoanalysts of her time. Her expansive interest in the subject led her to compile a detailed theory of neurosis to be this continuous process. Detailed theory. With neurosis commonly occurring sporadically in a person's life. That like someone had this neurosis and it kind of comes through in waves. This was in contrast to the opinions of her contemporaries who believed neurosis was more like a severe mental condition, a negative malfunction of the mind in response to external stimulus such as bereavement or divorce or negative experiences during childhood and adolescence. Horney placed significant emphasis on the parental indifference towards a child, believing that a child's perception of events as opposed to the parent's intention is the key to understanding a person's neurosis. That basically like how the child's making sense of the world more than what's actually happening is key to understanding any potential neurosis that they have. And I know I'm talking a lot before I let the video go, but actually maybe I'll let it go and then I'll get to these points. Sorry I'm a bit stuffed up. I'm at the tail end of a cold. Let's get back to this though.
Horney's ideas on why unconscious disturbances form and explore the possibility of attaining self-knowledge so as to free ourselves from their crippling influence. That many people wither rather than blossom as they age was intriguing to Horney, given her belief that in every individual is an innate drive to self-realization. To help explain the nature of this drive, Horney suggested that the development of a human being is analogous to that of an oak tree. Given appropriate environmental conditions, an acorn will develop into a healthy oak tree. It will flourish and fulfill its innate potential. In a similar manner, Horney posited that every individual will tend towards self-realization, provided we are not impeded by our environment. As she explains, you need not, and in fact cannot, teach an acorn to grow into an oak tree, but when given a chance, its intrinsic potentialities will develop. Similarly, the human individual, given a chance, tends to develop the unique alive forces of his real self, the clarity and depth of his own feelings, thoughts, wishes, interests, the ability to tap his own resources, the strength of his willpower. All this will in time enable him to find his set of values and aims in life. In short, he will grow substantially undiverted towards self-realization. Unfortunately, for many people, the movement towards self-realization is disrupted due to neglect, rejection, abuse, or other forms of childhood trauma. The child subjected to this early wounding is unable to say, "My parent has personal problems which are having an effect on me," but rather the child is only able to conclude that the world is unsafe. Hence, they become plagued by what Horney calls basic anxiety, which initially renders them helpless and overwhelmed, but over time propels them to find ways to cope with life despite their fears. They develop what Horney calls unconscious neurotic trends, which sculpt their personality so as to give them the semblance of safety in what is perceived to be a threatening environment. And when they emerge into adulthood, these neurotic trends do not disappear, but rather they continue to influence their attitudes and behaviors and wreak havoc on their well-being.
So let me just read this to you. So the 10 neurotic needs, according to Horney's coping strategies. So some are related to moving towards people, some are related to moving away from people. So number 1, the need for affection and approval, to be pleased others and to be liked by everyone. Number 2, the need to a partner, one whom they can love and who will solve all their problems. Number 3, the need for social recognition, fame, and limelight. Number 4, the need for personal admiration, both for inner and outer qualities to be valued. Number 5, so he said that focusing on all these, or she said that focusing on all these needs. So think about these all at the same time. The need for personal admiration for both inner and outer qualities. I already read that. The need for power, the ability to bend wills and achieve control over others. While most people seek strength, the neurotic may be in desperate need for it. The need to exploit others, to get the better of them, to become manipulative, fostering the belief that people are there to be used. And then there's the last few that are related to moving away from people. The need for personal achievement through virtually all personal wish to make achievement. The neurotic may be desperate for achievement. The need for self-sufficiency and independence. While most desire some autonomy, the neurotic may simply wish to discard other individuals entirely. The need for perfection. So there's 2 more. The need for, while many are driven to perfect their lives in the form of well-being, the neurotic may display a fear of being even slightly flawed. And lastly, the need to restrict life practices to within a narrow borders, to live as inconspicuous a life as possible, not ruffle any feathers. So she said those are the neurotic needs.
Is the individual who lives completely free from these unconscious relics left over from childhood. The type of neurotic trends which form depend upon both temperament and environmental factors. Some adapt to an unfavorable upbringing by detaching from life and other people. Others develop a neurotic need for approval and affection. Neurotic trends, however, are complex and individual and therefore defy rigid conceptualization. But when our behavior is unconsciously motivated by them, we tend to develop symptoms in due time. If we are not afflicted with phobias, depression, compulsions, severe apathy, codependency, addictions, or extreme indecision, we may become plagued by an inner emptiness or feel as if there is a vital element missing in our life. Rather than focusing on the outward manifestation of our symptoms, however, Horney advises us to fixate on their underlying source, that being the neurotic trends we developed as a means to cope with life. Psychoanalysis was founded by Sigmund Freud following his discovery that his patients' symptoms could be cured when the unconscious factors underlying them, be it repressed memories or emotions, were made conscious. Many followers of psychoanalysis, however, believed the excavation of unconscious material could only be conducted with the help of a trained therapist. But Karen Horney was one of the few 20th century psychoanalysts who thought it could be accomplished alone. She called this form of therapy self-analysis, and defined it as the attempt to be patient and analyst at the same time. But Horney did not deem self-analysis as merely a possibility. Rather, in many cases, she
think of self-analysis as being patient and therapist at the same time.
Thought it to be more desirable than traditional therapy. The therapist always begins as a stranger, who requires months if not years of analysis to learn of the inner workings, complexities, and depths of our mind. We, on the other hand, are intimately familiar with ourselves. Given the right attitude, we can, therefore, explore and expose the elements of our unconscious wreaking havoc on our life more efficiently than a trained therapist. Furthermore, self-analysis has the added benefit that it can increase our strength and confidence to a greater degree than traditional therapy. Just as traversing a difficult mountain path on our own grants us a greater feeling of accomplishment than following a guide, so too, Horney notes, there is a certain extra gain in having conquered inner territory entirely through one's own initiative, courage, and perseverance. Yet despite its benefits, self-analysis does not lack obstacles, the primary of which is how difficult self-knowledge is to attain. The curative role of self-knowledge has been recognized for thousands of years, in the West most notably in the philosophy of Socrates and Plato, and in the aphorism, "Know thyself," inscribed on the ancient Greek temple of Apollo at Delphi. But the ancient Greeks, Horney points out, believed the attainment of self-knowledge to be far easier than we do today. Exploring our inner depths, we now know, is no easy matter, but is rather akin to an adventure into an unknown territory full of surprises and potential dangers. In his book The Dawn of Day, Nietzsche echoes this sentiment by describing the vast gulf which separates the ancient Greek conception of the mind from the modern. How simple were the Greeks in the idea which they formed of themselves, he writes. How far we surpass them in the knowledge of man, again. How full of labyrinths would our souls and our conception of our souls appear in comparison with theirs? If we had to venture upon an architecture after the style of our own souls, we are too cowardly for that. A labyrinth would have to be our model. Another obstacle which confronts us in self-analysis is fear. Many avoid descending into their depths in the apprehension that they may stumble upon a deeply disturbing insight, or worse, become lost and confused in their inner labyrinth, unable to find their way out. But Horney dismisses these fears as unfounded. Uncovering an alarming truth or repressed memory, she notes, is not just painful but also liberating. And furthermore, if we come upon a disturbing insight, Horney explains that it usually implies we are strong enough to endure and work through it. The mere fact that he has gone that far, she writes, indicates that his will to come to grips with himself is strong enough to prevent him from being crushed. But even given its difficulties, self-analysis can be highly effective and beneficial, provided we have a strong incentive to grow. Horney in fact deems our motivation to overcome our problems as the primary determinant in whether self-analysis is successful or not. Experience shows beyond any doubt, she writes, that patients can develop an amazing faculty of keen self-observation if they are bent on understanding their own problems. Therefore, if we find ourselves overly passive, deeply unhappy, or saddled with symptoms we can't seem to shake, we could try to kindle a burning desire to find the key to our problems and set aside time for self-reflection and self-observation. Shining a light on the hidden corners of our mind can be uncomfortable and painful, but such a task may be necessary not only to free ourselves from the neurotic trends we developed in childhood, but also to restore the innate growth forces within and keep us steadfast on the path of self-realization, continuously growing, in the words of Horney, from acorn to oak tree. Self-knowledge is not an aim in itself, she writes, but a means of liberating the forces of spontaneous growth. In this sense, to work at ourselves becomes not only the prime moral obligation, but at the same time, in a very real sense, the prime moral privilege. To the extent that we take our growth seriously, it will be because of our own desire to do so.
Man, that was a pretty cool Karen Horney video. Yeah, fascinating scholar. So Piaget has to be on this list too. Huge name, huge role in the development of psychology. And again, he's often presented as a developmental psychologist, which he largely is. He's probably the most important developmental psychologist and influential for sure. Second only to Skinner as the most cited psychologist of the classical ones. Now the thing is at this point in your career, it's going to be hard to tell you much about Piaget you haven't already been exposed to, right? You've already heard of his stages of cognitive development, which is actually a really interesting idea because he actually thought that was a genetic thing. That's why he calls it a genetic epistemology. That actually how we understand our world, epistemology, goes through genetic stage jumps, right? Like sensory, motor, pre-operational, operational, formal, operational, concrete, operational. You all probably drew the chart, and it's actually really interesting, right? That the changes in mind are qualitative, not quantitative. It's not just that the computing power gets better. It's like the difference between whole different jumps of compute. It's qualitatively different. So I was trying to think of what I could tell you about Piaget that maybe you hadn't heard of. Maybe you hadn't heard of this idea that he had, that some people in their late teens and early 20s can go through a bit of what he called a messianic stage. Now this is interesting, right? Because what does messianic mean? That almost a godlike feeling stage. This model is used to explain why in late adolescence and early adulthood many young people are prone to adopt idealistic and utopian social and political ideas which they reassert with almost zealous vigor, like as if they're a religious prophet, or not prophet, prostolate, or not as if they're trying to convince you of a religion is what I'm trying to say. That's what zealous means. Like they're like over. Zealous can be a good word too, right? Zealous can mean that you're like, you believe something so much that you almost are that thing, but obviously that can also be very culty. Yet at the same time, and probably due to a lack of experience and this egocentric tendency, which we talked about in developmental psych being kind of core to adolescence, this kind of, not that they're cocky or arrogant, but that they're seeing everything from their perspective. That's what egocentric means. Because of this lack of experience and egocentric tendency, they tend to underestimate the difficulties and ramifications of attempts to implement their ideas in a complex real-world setting. Piaget said that. And I messed up a few times, so I would like to read that quote again. The stage model is used to explain why in late adolescence and early adulthood many young people are prone to adopt idealistic and utopian social and political ideas, which they reassert with almost zealous vigor. Yet at the same time, and probably due to a lack of experience and egocentric tendency, they tend to underestimate the difficulties and ramifications of attempts to implement their ideas in complex real-world settings. Bam. You wonder why I think he's one of the greatest. It's like, that's a devastating idea. It's like, I think I was like that probably. Are you saying like it's not? He's not saying it as a condemnation. He's saying it's like trying to understand the owner's manual of the mind. Right, and you combine this with some of the ideas of like Nietzsche and Durkheim and Jung, and it's like, yeah, well, it's like, what do you expect people to do if they don't have that religious underpinning? Those guys would all say, of course, they're going to fill it in with social political ideals, with the vigor of religion, because it is religion in their mind. It's not that it is religion; it's that it's in the same processes that you would deal with religion. You're using to deal with it. That's what he means. The zealous vigor. Prone to adopt idealistic and utopian social political ideals, which they reassert and post about with almost a zealous vigor. Interesting, right? if you don't like this idea and then you're finding it irritating, you could challenge it in your paper. That's the thing, is like, please know that that's something that's really important to me as a teacher. You don't have to agree hook, line, and sinker with every point I make. I would love if you challenge my points, but respectfully and idea-wise, right? Attack the idea. If you don't think that's true, tell me why you don't think it's true. It'd be an awesome paper. I think, I don't know, be careful though assuming Piaget is not right. Like, it's a mind-blowing idea if you really sit and think with it. So with Gordon Allport, we have probably the most prominent person in this developing field of personality psychology. Okay, so he's an American psychologist, one of the first psychologists to focus on the study of personality, a founding figure in personality psychology. He didn't believe that you could classify people according to like a small number of different traits. He thought that actually there's an incredible uniqueness to how traits worked, and he thought of traits as parts of personality. He thought that traits were actually habits. So think about this, that a trait is a habit that has social significance. So it's something you do that matters socially, and that you're made up of a bunch of traits. Your traits make up your personality, but all traits aren't the same. They exist in a hierarchy. Some are more cardinal, more directional. They shape how you see through other things. Like maybe something like loyalty, or it's like he's saying some are so core, and that's what he's saying, is that like it's so uniquely idiosyncratic, meaning like it's like each person is their own story. Each person has their own core cardinal traits, and then kind of central traits around that. So it's like, think of like the trait that kind of defines who you are, and then there's other ones around that, and then there's kind of broader secondary traits around those, and those all kind of make up this idea of personality. It's a pretty cool idea. Central traits present in various degrees. Central traits have this huge influence on our behavior, like whether we're honest or loyal or dependable or all these kind of things. Secondary traits also present in all individuals, can influence behavior, but secondary traits are strongly dependent on the immediate context, right? So like our environment. So it's a really interesting idea that a lot of us have similar traits, but that kind of our core orienting traits are different. That has this like butterfly effect through our whole personality, which is such a deep idea and is actually quite interesting. It's also interesting that I have the image of the book up there, The Nature of Prejudice, which he wrote in '54 and had a huge influence on both Dr. King and Malcolm X, which is interesting because those are quite different people. Their philosophies were much more similar after Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam. If you want to read an amazing book, you at some point in your life should read the autobiography of Malcolm X. Really interesting. Yeah, but Allport's philosophy on, or not philosophy, psychology of prejudice, The Nature of Prejudice, had a big influence on both of those people who are both huge names in the civil rights movement. You know, one of the greatest psychological minds of all time, and maybe the most important psychologist in the history of counseling specifically, the one that really started a lot of that and a lot of this person-centered and client-centered ideas, Carl Rogers. And you've heard of him before likely, and I wanted to, with some of these people that I figured you'd heard about a lot of times, like Piaget and Rogers and some of the people like that, I wanted to kind of pick a specific idea to focus on. And for this I want to focus on this idea of congruency, right? So he thought that like congruent means that they're kind of in line. He thought that like if the person that you want to be, your ideal self, and how you see yourself, if there's some overlap there, even if it's not perfect, it's like that's more congruent. And he saw that people were less incongruent when it was like, so less in line, when they want their life to be like this, but their life's like this. When there's a big difference between the ideal self and the self, and the idea of the self, right? So basically like who you want to be and who you see yourself as. The bigger the difference between those, the less congruent. Or another way of saying that is the more incongruent. Rogers' theory of self is considered to be humanistic and existential and phenomenological. So if we think about this for a sec, it's actually really interesting because it kind of bridges all the presentations. So his idea is humanistic in the sense that this is kind of a uniquely human aspect of that we have this ability to imagine these future potentialities of who we could be, but then also be like negatively critical of who we are right now, and then be very aware of the distance between that, even if we never articulate it like that. He said that that's like actually an existential thing, and it's actually a phenomenological thing because it has to do with how we're adding meaning to our experience of existence. His theory is based on this idea of the phenomenological field, or what it's like being you, or what it's like being me. He and his followers have demonstrated an approach to conducting therapy and scientific approaches to evaluating therapy need not being incompatible. So basically what I mean by that is like Rogers and Rogerian theorists after him went a long way in establishing this idea that you could actually rate what kind of therapeutic techniques work best. Right? And Rogers was a huge supporter of like videotaping sessions with clients and reviewing it with like counselor trainers, right? Like if you were to go train to be a Rogerian counselor, it's not just all book reading, right? It's like a lot of like, okay, well, let's go into, you're going to practice, you know, how do you do like an introduction, and how do you actually sit in a way that you're not too far away, that it's cold and not too close that it's awkward, and what are you supposed to be doing with your hands, and how are you making eye contact, and how much of your time are you looking down to take notes? And he's like, all those things are really important because they can create distance between the healer and the person seeking healing. Very focused on this phenomenological field. People are just as wonderful as sunsets if I can let them be. When I look at the sunset, I don't find myself saying, soften the orange a bit on the right-hand corner. I don't try to control the sunset. I watch it in awe as it unfolds. Okay, so Harlow, I don't know, I'm going to try this one again, it just messed up, but Harlow, best known for his experiments in isolating monkeys, especially the rhesus monkeys, and he had this whole colony of rhesus monkeys that he established at the University of Mass in Wisconsin. His research contributed a lot to our understandings of things like caregiving and affection and social relationships in early life. Harlow was an American psychologist best known for these maternal separation, taking a baby from mom and studying their dependency needs, these social isolation experiments with rhesus monkeys, and how that separation impacted their cognitive and social development. Because he was trying to make this argument that, and you know, it's interesting to think that he worked for some time with Maslow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and it's interesting to think that he was kind of interested in this idea of proving that love is actually an essential need, that it's not like a nice thing to have, that actually the mind decays without it, and that actually it's devastating to growth and development to not have it. So Maslow thought that, and you might find it interesting, I went on a rant about this on the part that got erased, but like that the University of Waterloo had a monkey lab, like a lot of the psych departments had their own breeding colonies because he needed constant access to young monkeys. Some of Harlow's final experiments explored social deprivation in a quest to create an animal model for the study of depression. This study is the most controversial and involved isolation of infant and juvenile macaque monkeys for various periods of time. Monkeys placed in isolation exhibited social deficits when introduced or reintroduced into a peer group. They appeared unsure of how to interact with their peers, and most stayed separate from the group, demonstrating the importance of social interaction and stimuli in the forming an ability to interact with peers in monkeys or in children. Harlow tried to reintegrate the monkeys who had been isolated for 6 months by placing them with monkeys who had been raised normally. The rehabilitation attempts were met with limited success. Harlow wrote that the total social isolation for the first 6 months of life produced severe deficits in virtually every aspect of social behavior. Isolates, which is what he called like the poor monkeys that were raised with no interaction. Isolates exposed to monkeys the same age who were reared normally achieved only a limited recovery of simple social responses. Wow. He found also devastatingly that if he took the monkey for 3 months and totally isolated it, but then put it around normal monkeys, it would recover almost everything. But 6 months and put it back, it would recover almost nothing. So again, this gets to this critical sensitive periods idea that we're going to see picked up again with Bowlby.
The truth is that as the struggle for survival has subsided, the question has emerged: survival for what? Even more people today have the means to live, but no meaning to live for.
All right, the great Viktor Frankl. With Frankl, I think I'm going to go a bit light on today because I have a tendency to rant about Frankl. He's definitely one of my favorite psychologists, and I think Man's Search for Meaning is one of the most important psychology books ever written. And if you haven't heard me talk about Frankl before, he's so fascinating because he obviously was imprisoned in Auschwitz during Nazi occupation, and during his time in the prison camp developed this idea of logotherapy, and then came out and wrote this. And then when he came out of the prison camp, he realized that his wife had had been killed during that time. And he kind of went into this depression and threw himself into his writing and wrote this book, Man's Search for Meaning, where he kind of, at the beginning, the first half of the book's about his experience in the camp, and then the second half of the book's about, well, the psychotherapy that he developed as a response to that experience and to help other people. That was called logotherapy, or meaning-based, purpose-based therapy.
These are the words of Viktor Frankl, a 20th century Viennese psychiatrist, most famous for his book Man's Search for Meaning. In that book, Frankl details his time spent as a Nazi concentration camp prisoner, and reflects on how one can find meaning in life even in the harshest of conditions. Frankl, whose interest in the topic of life's meaning began as a teenager, came to the realization that while ever more people in Western nations were living lives of material comfort, all too many lived in a detrimental psychological state he called the existential vacuum. As he explained, the existential vacuum is a widespread phenomenon of the 20th century. This is understandable. It may be
It means that, and he's obviously going to go through this more detailed definition, but sort of that at the core that people feel empty. It's like this real deep core existential emptiness, or vacuum. It's like literally a vacuumous pit. That people can feel this existential vacuum. What a devastating term. He thought it was a widespread phenomena of the 20th century.
Due to a twofold loss which man has had to undergo since he became a truly human being. At the beginning of human history, man lost some of the basic animal instincts in which an animal's behavior is embedded and by which it is secured. In addition to this, however, man has suffered another loss in his more recent development, inasmuch as the traditions which buttressed his behavior are now rapidly diminishing. No instinct tells him what he has to do, and no tradition tells him what he ought to do. Sometimes he does not even know what he wishes to do. Instead, he either wishes to do what other people do, conformism, or he does what other people wish him to do, totalitarianism. The preponderance of people living lives absent of meaning led to the emergence of what Frankl called the mass neurotic triad. This was a term he coined to describe the three most common symptoms associated with lives lived in the existential vacuum, namely depression, aggression, and addiction. To help counter the dire effects that accompany a life without meaning, Frankl founded a school of psychiatry called logotherapy, which in Frankl's words, considers man as a being whose main concern consists of fulfilling a meaning and in actualizing values, rather than in the mere gratification and satisfaction of drives and instincts. In the remainder of this video, we will outline some of the key insights of logotherapy, insights Frankl believed could greatly assist one in living a more fulfilling life. A key tenet of logotherapy is that the pursuit of meaning, or what Frankl sometimes referred to as the will to meaning, is the primary motivational factor in humans. This can be contrasted to other schools of psychiatry which maintain that the pursuit of pleasure or the will to power are the primary factors. According to Frankl, it is when individuals fail to find meaning in their lives that they turn to the dogged pursuit of pleasure or power, in the false belief that...
And remember, this is like Freud, the first Viennese school, Adler's the second, Frankl's the third. Pursuit of pleasure, pursuit of power, pursuit of meaning.
That so doing will fill the void that an absence of meaning has left in them. For those who decide to pursue a more meaningful existence, Frankl emphasized that doing so did not mean searching for the ultimate meaning of life, as he put it. This ultimate meaning necessarily exceeds and surpasses the finite intellectual capacities of man. What is demanded of man is not, as some existential philosophers teach, to endure the meaning.
Right, so this is, sorry to keep pausing in the middle of the quote, but this is actually an important point, right? When he says, like, the purpose of your life is to find the meaning of life, he's not really saying, like, you have to all be like in, sorry, my daughter loves Kung Fu Panda, and you have to, like, find the dragon scroll that says the secret. It's like, he means it in a much more practical, individualized way.
Meaninglessness of life, but rather to bear his incapacity to grasp its unconditional meaningfulness in rational terms. While the ultimate meaning of life is unknowable, Frankl held that each person had the opportunity to realize meaning in their life at a personal level, and so doing would greatly improve the quality of their life. It should be noted that Frankl did not believe that individuals created such meaning. Rather, he believed it was discovered and was present in every living moment, whether one was aware of it or not. As he put it, I am convinced that in the final analysis, there is no situation that does not contain within it the seed of a meaning. In order to discover and realize these personal seeds of meaning, Frankl suggested that for most people a change of attitude is required. We need to stop asking about the meaning of life, and instead to think of ourselves as those who are being questioned by life daily and hourly. Our answer must consist not in talk and meditation, but in right action and right conduct. Life ultimately means the responsibility to find the right answers to its problems and to fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets for each individual. Frankl stressed that as unique individuals, meaning will present itself in different ways to each person. Each of us face different situations in our lives, some of which are more and some of which are less under our control and influence. Frankl's belief was that no matter what fate brought, if one took appropriate action and adopted the right attitude to the situation, a meaningful life could be realized. In a passage in Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl nicely distinguished how actualizing personal meaning differs from the search for abstract answers to life's meaning. To put the question of the meaning of life in general terms would be comparable to the question posed to a chess champion. Tell me, master, what is the best move in the world? There simply is no such thing as the best or even a good move apart from a particular situation in a game and the particular personality of one's opponent. The same holds for human existence. One should not search for an abstract meaning of life. Everyone has his own specific vocation or mission in life to carry out a concrete assignment which demands fulfillment. As Frankl notes, often the best way to live a life rich with meaning is to find one's unique vocation. Nothing contributes more to the feeling of a meaningless existence than boredom, and nothing counters feelings of boredom better than having a specific mission to carry out in one's life. In this respect, Frankl was fond of quoting Nietzsche's famous passage that he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. Finding one's why was, according to Frankl, the best way to live a meaningful and therefore fulfilling life. However, for some, adopting a vocation and striving to achieve the goals associated with it is beyond.
It's interesting how so many of these real heavyweights in the history of psychology were heavily influenced by Nietzsche.
Beyond their reach. Instead, some people face situations which they have little control over, situations which can cause immense suffering, such as being diagnosed with a terminal illness or, in Frankl's case, being imprisoned in a concentration camp. But even in such situations, as Frankl discovered firsthand, one has the opportunity to find meaning. And we will conclude this video with a passage which reflects this important belief of Frankl's. We must never forget that we may also find meaning in life even when confronted with a hopeless situation, when facing a fate that cannot be changed. For what then matters is to bear witness to the uniquely human potential at its best, which is to transform a personal tragedy into a triumph, to turn one's predicament into a human achievement. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves.
Ooh. Yeah, and remember he's talking about not being able to change the situation while he was in Auschwitz. He was in, Auschwitz and Dachau were probably, they were all bad, but probably two of the worst, right? Those were the ones you are most likely to have heard of and studied about. Frankl would have everybody get together and you'd organize kind of informally for people to stand in circles and tell about what their favorite songs are and tell about, their trip to the beach and have everybody listen. and that actually kept people alive. It's like, here, take my happy story and let it sit in your mind for a few minutes as an escape. Just another absolute, if you're in my developmental psych class, I referred to this, like, kind of a lot of these same people as giants of psychology. And he is most certainly on that list. Okay, Bowlby, and where you've definitely heard about him, especially if you've been taking a lot of developmental psych courses, is in relation to Mary Ainsworth, right? And he had this idea around attachment theory with Ainsworth, who was one of his grad students. And actually, she might have even been an undergrad student, but I kind of forget. Mary Ainsworth is a really interesting psychologist who was doing work with Bowlby's theories, and I think she's actually from the University of Toronto, which is super interesting. And Ainsworth and Bowlby sort of get co-tied to this idea of attachment theory, which you all learned about in developmental psych, right? And he was really focused on how this early attachment, this early priming between mom and baby, is related to developmental functioning. And it's kind of interesting that Bowlby may have heard me in other scenarios talk about a famous psychologist named Melanie Klein, who was actually his supervisor. But they had a breaking over the idea of the role of the mother, which is kind of interesting. Yeah, but I have there, like, he was heavily influenced by Klein's idea of play therapy. He was also, though, heavily influenced by this friend of his who was a zoologist named Conrad Lawrence, who I actually mentioned in the biology presentation. And this guy was fascinated by this critical and sensitive period. So I'm hoping you're starting to see how interconnected all these people are, right? They're all influencing each other and being influenced and commenting on each other's work and stuff. And he was interested in this idea of how the goose implants, the baby implants onto the mom, imprints, right? Puts the psychological concept and emotional attachment of mom onto mom. And that it can happen with the cat, like in that little graphic image or whatever I have up there. Bowlby was heavily influenced by Lawrence, who was fascinated by this idea of critical and sensitive periods during which the geese imprint to their mother. Bowlby's research found that after a critical period of about 32 hours have passed, the goose loses basically all ability to put mom to something. If you take the goose as soon as it's been born, you isolate it for, a day and a half, it loses its ability to attach mom to something. But if you put it around anything that moves, it could be a remote control, it could be something that's being blown around the room artificially by a fan, it could be a cat, it could be a human. The first thing it sees move, it's going to imprint, because that's so core to its survival, is finding mom right away within that first day and a half, usually within the first seconds, a couple minutes. It's really interesting how that is kind of what got him thinking about stuff that eventually leads to these ideas around human attachment. So I thought you'd find this quote interesting. So this is Bowlby talking about how people kind of responded to his attachment theory idea. There are certain groups who took it with great enthusiasm. Other groups were directly lukewarm and other hostile. Each profession reacted differently. The social workers took it with enthusiasm. The psychoanalysts treated it with caution, curiosity, and for me, infuriatingly, pediatricians were initially hostile, but subsequently many of them became very supporting. Adult psychiatrists, totally uninterested, totally ignorant, totally uninterested. Interesting that he says uninterested there twice. Totally uninterested, totally ignorant, totally uninterested. So you can see he's not the biggest fan of the psychiatry movement of the day.
The impetus that makes you fly is our great human possession. Everybody has it. It is the feeling of being linked with the roots of power, but one soon becomes afraid of this feeling. That is why most people shed their wings and prefer to walk and obey the law. The 20th century psychologist Abraham Maslow was convinced that within us all exists an impulse to achieve greatness and an urge to move toward what he called our highest possibilities. Few among us, however, achieve anything of great worth. While there are various reasons for this, one of them, according to Maslow, is simply that we fear our greatness more than we desire it. We are generally afraid to become that which we can glimpse in our most perfect moments. We enjoy and even thrill to the godlike possibilities we see in ourselves, and yet we simultaneously shiver with weakness, awe, and fear before these very same possibilities.
The name of this book, The Farther Reaches of Human Nature. So Maslow, born in Brooklyn, New York, has got to be one of the most famous American psychologists. The other ones you'd have to put on that list would be like, well, B.F. Skinner for sure, William James for sure, and then like, well, all the other people like Rogers and Glaser and Philip Zimbardo, and that'd be a pretty good start for some of the most famous American psychologists. So Maslow presents this humanistic psychology as basically 4 core ideas. You don't have to have this written down because I know they're not on the slide, but I just want to read these to you. Number 1, someone's present functioning is their most significant aspect. As a result, humanistic psychology emphasizes this here and now idea rather than trying to examine the past or future. Which, that's kind of a reference to Freud, right? Because Freud's all about the past. Number 2, to be mentally healthy, individuals must take personal responsibility for their actions, regardless of their actions are positive or negative. This has a lot of similarities with an idea we're going to finish up with today with choice psychology. Number 3, that's William Glaser. Each person, simply by being, is inherently worthy. While any given action may be negative, these actions do not cancel out the value of the person. That's a difficult point, though. Like, what if, are all evils justifiable? And then if you say, well, no, some things are so bad they're not justifiable, then are some people without value? I don't know. This is where you get into you have to present some terrible hypotheticals to argue this point, right? Number 4, the ultimate goal of living is to attain personal growth and understanding. Only through constant self-improvement and self-understanding can an individual ever be truly happy. Just notice how this is humans have this unique psychological challenge we need to deal with. It's very different than Freud's very biological determinism idea. Humanistic. So you can see why this whole movement's called humanistic. It's like focusing on this idea that, and remember, they're kind of coming historically after kind of psychology being dominated by the behavioralists and by like animal experimentation and your Skinners and your Pavlovs and Thorndike and all these people, right? Harlow, who we're going to get to soon. Or I'm doing this a bit out of order. We might have already done, actually.
Maslow called this fear of greatness the Jonah complex, in reference to the biblical character Jonah, who attempted to flee from the fate bestowed on him by God. In this video, we'll investigate the psychology behind this fear and examine how we can overcome it. In his book Art and Artist, Otto Rank argued that human beings are driven by 2 fundamental fears, a fear of death and a fear of life. The fear of death, according to Rank, is not merely a fear of our physical extinction. We also fear a type of psychological death which occurs when we conform so fully with societal norms that we lose our individuality. This fear, according to Rank, motivates us to differentiate ourselves by actualizing the potentials which make us unique. It drives us to exist in the Latin sense of the word, that is, to step out, stand forth, emerge, appear. Standing out too much, however, can stimulate feelings of loneliness and
that's like one of the best parts in the book 1984, right, where Winston Smith has this rebellious idea that, and he gets possessed by this idea that he's going to go and get a book, try to go to one of these old stores in the kind of like outskirts and try to get one of these old notebooks that he's heard about and get a pen. He's going to write something down because remember, keeping personal journals and under Big Brother is strictly forbidden and punishable by jail. So famously in his apartment in the book 1984, Winston Smith has a brick that he can pull out and he hides the journal there and then puts the brick back in, and he gets the journal the one time and he decides he's going to write something, and he just starts writing, and he starts writing drivel, talking about how the party's so good, and he realizes he's just basically writing out a commercial from the government that he's seen a million times, and he scraps it and he's trying to think of an original thought, and eventually just writes down, I exist.
And isolation. The more we individuate, the more we lose the comforting protection of the crowd, and it is this fear of standing alone which Rank characterized as the fear of life. This fear, Rank argued, drives us to re-establish a greater connection with society via conformity and to reject much of what makes us unique. The life of each person alternates between the impulse to individuate, driven by the fear of death, and the impulse to conform, driven by the fear of life. Between these two fear possibilities, he wrote, the individual is thrown back and forth all his life. For most of us, the fear of life predominates over the fear of death. We are more afraid of standing out, of daring to be different, than we are of relinquishing our individuality. This analysis of Rank's suggests that at its root our fear of greatness is a fear of life, a fear of standing alone and of separating ourselves from the masses. For as Nietzsche so often liked to remark, the concept of greatness entails being able to be different. But a fear of life is not the only thing inhibiting us from actualizing our potential. Colin Wilson, one of the most prolific authors of the 20th century, suggested that an insignificance neurosis permeates modern society, acting as an additional barrier to the cultivation of one's greatness.
An insignificance neurosis. Remember, this is, again, you have to give them a little bit of forgiveness, because like nowadays neurosis isn't usually the language we use, but like when Wilson was writing, it was still like the appropriate language. But he's saying it's like it's a mental illness of insignificance. Not that the mental illness is insignificant, but what's causing the illness is internalized feelings of insignificance.
Wilson observed that much of 20th century thought was dominated by what he called the unheroic hypothesis, which he defined as the sense of defeat or disaster or futility that seems to underlie so much modern writing. In answering the age-old question, is man more akin to a god or a worm, he thought the modern age instilled in the individual a belief that we are much closer to the worm, thus helping explain the average individual's tendency to accept a life far below their potential. Abraham Maslow, a friend of Colin Wilson's, came to very similar conclusions. Maslow made a habit of...
So, what a fascinating... I didn't really realize, and you know that how I do this with the Pursuit of Wonder and Academy Ideas videos, is sometimes I like to pepper them into these videos and not pre-watch them, because I really trust these guys, and I know that they do high quality, and I know these authors really, like I know like Maslow and these people well, so, it just makes the videos kind of, I hope adds a neat element to it. But what I didn't really realize he was going to do is make this link that's so fascinating between Maslow, Carl Wilson, and Otto Rank, and basically use Otto Rank's depth psychology idea of the fear of life and the fear of death as a way of understanding Maslow's concept of self-actualization. Sorry, I just kind of hiccuped while talking. But I shouldn't drink Pepsi while I'm doing a video. That's a ridiculous presenter move. Right? It should be water or warm tea. But, you know, we do our best. All right, back to the video.
Asking his students who among them would write a great novel, or become a great leader or composer, and discovered that, generally, everybody starts giggling, blushing, and squirming until I ask, if not you, then who else? Which of course is the truth. If you deliberately plan to be less than you are capable of being, then I warn you that you'll be deeply unhappy for the rest of your life. You will be evading your own capacities, your own possibilities. Maslow thought the anxiety displayed by his students was the result of an inability to fathom the godlike possibilities within for too long, without succumbing to the fear that such arrogance could lead to unhealthy delusions of grandeur. As a result of this fear, people tend to the opposite extreme, and view themselves as more analogous to a worm, incapable of achieving anything of significance. Maslow, however, believed that both extremes, seeing oneself as a god or a worm, were equally detrimental. He therefore advised we find the golden mean or middle way. To overcome our fear of greatness, we must learn to move boldly towards our goals, while simultaneously maintaining humility in the awareness that we are all, after all, human, all too human. Or as Maslow explained, for some people this evasion of one's own growth, setting low levels of aspiration, the fear of doing what one is capable of doing, voluntary self-crippling, are in fact defenses against grandiosity, arrogance, sinful pride, hubris. There are people who cannot manage that graceful integration between the humility and the pride which is absolutely necessary for creative work. To invent or create, you must have the arrogance of creativeness, which so many investigators have noticed. But of course, if you have only the arrogance without the humility, then you are in fact delusional. You must be aware not only of the godlike possibilities within, but also of the existential human limitations. If you can be amused by the worm trying to be God, then in fact you may be able to go on trying and being arrogant without fearing delusions of grandeur. This is a good technique.
That's what I mean. It's like Maslow. People think Maslow is just that triangle. It's like, that is a very interesting psychological model, no doubt about it. Like his needs model, and you probably analyzed it for its strengths and weaknesses and stuff. But like, man, that was an awesome quote to end with. But you can see almost how people have made, if you thought that Maslow sounded a little bit Buddhist by stressing that middle road, you wouldn't be the first to make that comparison, right? Like, people have said that about Maslow. A super interesting guy. So another one of these existential and kind of humanistic psychologists that would be really interesting for you to look into if they're the one you choose is Rollo May, right? Rollo May wrote this amazing book called The Cry for Myth that you should check out for your library. Pointed out that the major existential issue of our time is this loss of values, that we don't have these like centering values from which every other decision is made. It's The Cry for Myth is the book I'm focusing on here. Rollo May's most famous book, though, was called Love and Will. He's often associated with humanistic psychology, often talked about alongside Viktor Frankl. He was also a really close friend of Paul Tillich, who we talked about earlier in the existential presentation. So in The Cry for Myth, let me just read this one thing. In The Cry for Myth, May believes that humans can use myth to help them make sense of their lives, based on case studies that May uses from his patients. He discusses how this could be particularly useful for those who are needing direction in a confusing world. That's from Rollo May's book, The Cry for Myth, 1991. All the different values around us lead us to doubt all values, as Nietzsche pointed out. If God is dead, i.e., absolutes are gone, then anything's permitted. Then we all just drown in relativism. So we're tasked with creating our own values according to May. Right? This is an idea very similar to Nietzsche. Right? So Nietzsche and May are both saying this idea that, okay, well, if you're in this valueless situation, and we're human beings that are dependent, sorry, these lights keep switching, and you're in this situation where, well, human beings function best when they're in value-enriched environments, then what you need to do is generate values, right? So this is kind of Nietzsche's idea of the Superman, but this is also similar to what Rollo May is saying, right? Jung's idea was different. Jung's idea was that you actually had to go back into your roots. So it's like, say you know that your family way back in the day comes from Scotland or from Norway or something like that, and it's like Jung would be like, oh, research the traditions of the people as far back as you can figure out about your family's history. There's something in that to tell you about who you are. Rollo May was fascinating. He also has another book called something like The Courage to Create. He has tons of books. We're tasked with creating our own values, he thought. And he thought about this idea of that there's like guiding narratives. So it's like there's always these ideas of like the hero and so there's a male and female, positive and negative. So like the male positive is the wise king, and the male negative is the tyrannical king or father, the wise father or king. And then the evil queen or the evil mother, and the loving mother or the benevolent queen. Right, that those are actually archetypes in the hero and the Joker, trickster, Loki. Right, so you can see how May's idea of guiding narratives and Jung's idea of archetypes are basically the same. And if you didn't know what I meant by that, it's that like, well, why is it that all these stories across time, whether you're looking at like a story that comes from like the Western North, like the Scotland and the deep Norse areas, like a story that's really old, like Beowulf, or whether you're looking at like a Mesopotamian ancient story like the Epic of Gilgamesh, or whether you're looking at the story of Hercules, or the story of Quetzalcoatl, right, which is like the serpent god of the Mesopotamian, or of the ancient, like, kind of South American traditions. It's interesting how many of these psychoanalysts were fascinated by the hero myth. He thought that it actually maintained people. Examples of shows that, and I thought that this was really interesting. It's like, what would be some examples of guiding narratives? The Bible, Aesop's fables, like Aesop, fascinating, right? Aesop was actually a slave who had all these stories. He was this wise person, and someone wrote down his stories, right? And they've survived thousands of years. Samoan, and he was, or Samoa. He was from, I think it's a bit in question where he was actually from. But like, yeah, Aesop's fables is fascinating. I go over it with my daughter all the time. I have a beautiful Aesop's fable book. You've heard of it, like the tortoise and the hare, and the lion with the thorn in his palm that the mouse pulls out, and Shakespeare, South Park, where it's like South Park kind of shows these like ideas in everybody. It's like a metaphor for everything else. Sort of like what an archetype is in a modern way. So here's another guy you probably come across in your schooling, right? And I won't spend tons of time on this because I know you've probably heard of Alfred Ellis, and he had this ABC model, right? And he thought that like something happens, so an adversity, and then there's some kind of consequence. But what really shapes the consequences, our belief about the thing, right? So if we like have something negative happen and we think, well, now that that's happened, it's the end of the world, then that really shapes how we behave. How we make sense of the bad thing shapes how we respond, is sort of his idea. And so he developed this idea, or this approach called rational emotive behavioral therapy, that you actually, you can see how it's kind of related to cognitive behavioral therapy, because rational and cognitive are sort of similar. Like rationality is an aspect of cognition, and then behavioral therapy, but he throws the word emotive in there because he's talking about how our thoughts affect our emotions, which shape our behaviors. In a 1982 survey of professional psychologists in Canada and the States, he was considered the second most influential, with Carl Rogers as the first and Freud as the third. Thought you might find that interesting. He was heavily influenced by Karen Horney, Alfred Adler, Erich Fromm, Harry Stack Sullivan. His approach stressed actively working to change a client's self-defeating beliefs and behaviors by demonstrating their irrationality, right? Like actually getting people, when they're in their worst mood, to write out their ideas and then critique them when they're in a better mood and show how they're not rational, and have them actually articulate and write out how they're not rational. That actually started to affect how people would cycle thoughts in their mind in the future. Ellis believed that through rational analysis and through cognitive reconstruction, people could understand their self-defeatingness in light of their core rational beliefs, and then develop more rational constructs to understand themselves. But if you look into Albert Ellis, you'll notice he's also kind of a interesting guy, and he became heavily involved in like the kind of sexual revolution of the 60s in this like emerging field of sexology, and like, so he's kind of interesting in that sense too. But like, I think if you were to say, especially in a course like this or a presentation like this focusing on these psychotherapeutic principles, what Ellis added to the mix was absolutely a lot of theoretical depth to this idea of what's eventually going to kind of become CBT, and this whole idea of understanding the relationship between the way how rationally we're interpreting our experience, right? And that when we're not being rational, like when we're upset, it's actually hugely problematic because it means we're not interpreting our world correctly. And it's leading to all these problems in our own mental health and in our relationships and at work and everything.
I don't know if this is exactly on the point, but it's something I'd like to share with you. The idea that the event is never that which determines your fate. It's your coping with the event. Death, sickness, all kinds of things happen to human beings. And the fate of what happens as a result is in the coping. I know a lot of people who say, well, if you lived right, you wouldn't have those things to cope with. I don't think we know enough about that, how we can avoid things, and I don't think avoiding things is helpful anyway. But it's the coping with these things that give us the kind of strength and give us our opportunities. So death is something to cope with.
Yeah.
We all are going to die one day.
And you also point out quite a bit that we all have weaknesses. We're all imperfect. None of us can see our own back.
Right, exactly. This is important to remember too, because the piece, how I look at reality, no, I'll change that. What I think a reality is what I see. Okay? What I see is not the total reality, and here's where the back comes in. You've got a back, and everybody's got a back, but how many people have seen it? A lot of other people see your back, but you don't see it.
So we always have the unknown just right behind us.
That's right, and that's, we see when you start putting things together like that, Jeff, then you begin to get an awareness of the absurdity of thinking that all there is in the world is what you see in it.
Well, you focused quite a lot in your lifetime on human potential, on dealing with people who come, from tormented families where there was abuse, where the parents didn't get along with each other. These are the kind of situations that I suppose socially we tend to blame on our worst social problems, drugs and crime. And you feel very hopeful that a person's life need not be conditioned by their past.
Well, it's not only a matter of my feeling, but I've demonstrated that. Now, let me give you a little metaphor. Let's think that the human being has countless number of little jets, that there's a fountain inside that has countless number of jets. And if our energy were free to flow, then these jets were all open, that this would just put in fantastic energy. But most of these, or many of these jets, are closed. We shouldn't do this and we shouldn't do that, and who's going to hate us if we do this and that and something else. So as a result, we live half lives. No.
When you say it sounds like they're closed because of our own sort of mental chatter.
Exactly, exactly. There are all the rules about what we shouldn't do. When we open those up, you know what happens to a fountain where only some of the jets will let water come out?
Yeah.
Sometimes the water comes out in big gushes in some of them, and it's very uneven because the central pressure to make the water come out is stopped by the holes that are stopped. Okay, and I believe that's our central place inside of us with the energy. So opening up all of these holes, so to speak, which are our feelings and are our possibilities, and that when we allow that to happen, then we become in a totally different place, because we then can have harmony moving, and we have the total force of the energy that's possible. And that's all I've done with people, is open up.
Help people get really in touch with their feelings again.
Their feelings, and allow themselves to remember that their feelings are not the parts of them that decide what should happen. Feelings are like a temperature, a thermometer which say what things are. You move over to another part of yourself when you make decisions. But a lot of people have said, if you go into your feelings, that's going to be the basis of your decisions.
You'll make a bad decision then. So
That's right.
Cut off your feelings completely.
And so what is the important thing is that our feelings are like the juice that keeps us in a whole piece and gives us the ability to see better, to think better, to feel better. They owned emotions. But an emotion that you have which isn't owned, you say, no, I don't have it, is one that splits your energy, because it puts you into this kind of thing. You cannot say that you aren't what you are. Now, what I mean is, yes, you can say that, but that doesn't change it. If you're angry, for instance, and you say, oh, no, I'm not angry, or you're feeling very excited about something, you say, no, I'm not excited. See, those are the kinds of emotional lies that just steal our energy away.
All right, I got Charlotte here with me. We're going to read you the Declaration of Self-Esteem by Virginia Satir. You ready? My little girl's a little person, not feeling the greatest. You okay? You can be okay for one poem here? I am me. In all the world, there's no one else exactly like me, or exactly like you. Because everything that comes out of me is authentically mine, because I alone choose it. I own everything about me, my body, my feelings, my mouth, my voice, all my actions, whether they be to others or to myself. I own my fantasies, my dreams, my hopes, my fears. I own all my triumphs and successes, all my failures and mistakes, because I own all of me. I can become intimately, right? I can become intimately acquainted with myself. By doing so, I can love me and be friendly with me in all my parts. I know that there are aspects about myself that puzzle me and other aspects I do not know, but as long as I am friendly and loving to myself, I can courageously and hopefully look for solutions to the puzzle and find ways to find out more about me. You digging it? However I look and sound, whatever I say and do, and whatever I think and feel at a given moment in time is authentically me. If later some parts of how I looked, sounded, thought, and felt turn out to be unfitting, I can discard that which is unfitting, keep the rest, and invent something new for that which I discarded. I can see, hear, feel, think, say, do. I have the tools to survive, to be close to others. Poor girl, stuffed up. I have the tools to survive, to be close to others, to be productive, and to make sense and order out of a world and people and things outside of me. I own me, and therefore I can engineer me. I am me, and I am okay. You're okay too, Charlotte, even though your shirt looks a bit gross. Alright, love yous. See you on the next slide. Okay, this is probably personally one of the books that affected my life the most. I would big time recommend this book, Choice Theory: A New Psychology of Personal Freedom by William Glasser, and you read it and it's like it's written straight to you. It's like choosing the life you need to live and staying close to the people that you need. And he's kind of famous for two ideas. One is choice theory, and then the 3 R's of reality therapy he used to talked about a lot. This idea of being realistic and realism, taking responsibility for our choices and our actions, and then being constantly kind of appraising right and wrong, this like moral aspect. Glasser's work highlights this idea of personal choice, personal responsibility, personal transformation. Choice theory suggests that there's this kind of quality world, and we're all trying to experience aspects of that quality world, which is actually really interesting because it's a deep idea, and it's similar to Plato's idea of the world of ideas, or the ideal, and it's also similar to Jung's idea of archetypes. Yeah, so Glasser, very interesting guy, but basically focusing on this idea that like psychological growth comes from this sort of extreme ownership of the thoughts that you allow to go through your head, and that obviously that's not that easy, but it's like no one said it was easy. It's actually a highly structured, complex process to gain control over your choices that you're making. This new psychology of personal freedom. Again, I highly recommend this book if you haven't read it. And this is one of his ideas. Like, he was really heavy on this idea of learning by doing. And he says we learn 10% of what we read, 20% of what we hear, 30% of what we see, 50% of what we hear and see, 70% of what's discussed, 80% of what we experience personally, 95% of what we teach to someone else. It's actually an interesting quote. It's like, because to get to the point of teaching, you have to be able to explain it, and to be able to explain it, you got to kind of know it. And it's like, he's got a point. Is it healthy to be adjusted to a sick society? It's like, that's like a Rollo, I almost said Rollo May. That's an R.D. Laing kind of quote. And it's like, he was very, let me just read this. Before one goes through the gate, one may not be aware that there is a gate. One may think that there's a gate to go through and look for a long time for it without finding it. One may find it and it may not open. And if it opens, one may be through it. As one goes through it, it may see as that the gate one went through was the self that went through it. No one went through a gate. There was no gate to go through. No one ever found a gate. No one ever realized that there was never a gate. He thought that the mind of the schizophrenic made sense based on their subjective experience. And so Rollo May was considered an anti-psychiatrist, but he himself refuted that claim. He was definitely the most famous Scottish psychiatrist of all time. He wrote extensively on mental illness, particularly psychosis and very specifically schizophrenia. He was a big time against the use of electric shock for schizophrenic treatment. Again, you got to kind of keep in mind the time period, right? He's not necessarily against like 2022's ways of dealing with schizophrenia. He was against the kind of techniques of the time, which were largely, well, electroconvulsive. Laing saw psychopathology as not being seated in the biological or the psyche, but in the environment, which he called the social cradle, the urban home, which cultivates it, the very crucible in which the self is forged. Yeah, interesting guy. The politics of experience, super interesting. He also has a book about schizophrenia that's really interesting that's called The Divided Self. And then the last one, the last slide of the presentation is Irvin Yallom, probably the biggest name in group psychology, like group as in, and I don't mean group as in like kind of crowd psychology, I mean group as in like a therapy group, had to like have a psychotherapeutic group. And he said that like psychotherapeutic groups were kind of characterized by these things like universality and, or like basically you're having, say we got together and talked about our experiences during this pandemic, and just hearing everyone talk, it's like, let's use that as the example and I'll explain all these words. So say we're doing that and it's like, you tell me your story of how it's affected you and I tell you a bit about mine, and we can bond a bit about that shared experience of universality, and maybe we can, think of, and then sometimes sharing and hearing other people's success can give hope, and we can share information, and there can be that niceness of being in a tight group, and there can be a cathartic experience related to sharing and positive socialization, and this idea of giving an opportunity to be helpful to others, or altruism, like with other members of the group, and that there can be this interpersonal back and forth learning, and that it addresses these deep existential factors relating to belongingness and feeling important and feeling like we're moving in a proper direction, that we can learn how to imitate other people, that we can have a corrective recapitulation of the primary family group. That is one of the deepest ideas in psychology. But Yalom had this idea that so much trauma happens in the family context, and that those kind of dynamics can exist within a therapeutic group, and that gives a therapeutic group a unique power to have healing influences on people. Yalom is an American existential psychiatrist who's an who is a professor of psychiatry, professor emeritus. I don't know why that was messing me up so much. At Stanford University, as well as an author of both fiction and nonfiction. He talks about these 4 givens of the human condition, which I have there: isolation, meaninglessness, mortality, and freedom, and that these are all questions that in our quest to better ourselves we need to address. He published in 1970, I have this book somewhere, The Theory and Practice of Group Psychotherapy, which is an absolute classic in the field. And yeah, Irvin Yallom. This is the last one of today, but I would say the biggest name in group psychotherapy. So that brings us to the end of, Psychotherapeutic Principles. I hope this presentation was okay, and I've really enjoyed being your teacher in this class. I know it's a little bit of a different class, but I think it's starting to pull together, and I got a good plan. I actually kind of set myself up for a lot of heavy work at the beginning, right? Like this presentation and the bioevolutionary one and the positive psychology one and the existential one. I was all basically making from scratch as I was going, which was the plan the whole time. But as we get into the second part, and as we get into some of the coaching and leadership philosophy and stuff, some of that is like, I have presentations I've already been working on, especially over the Christmas holidays. So I've kind of set myself up that I have a little bit of those resources already prepared, so and almost ready to record already. So hopefully I'll be able to keep up pace as we keep moving forward. But I've loved being your teacher in this. You've been such polite, amazing students, and thank you for that, honestly. Cheers, and see you in the next video coming soon, my friends.